Dahlia. We are so happy to have you here today for your baptism. My name is Brian, and in just a few minutes, I'm going to be something like a brother to you through your baptism. Actually, you're about to get a lot more siblings and friends here through your baptism today. Now, I've been talking to your parents about your baptism and what it means to them and might mean to you. And so they asked me to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. Now, I can't tell you much, but we'll make a start of it. But I promise that all the people here will help tell this story more as you get older. Now, one of the things that we're doing today, Dahlia, is we're starting to tell you our story. Our story of what it means to be God's people. There's a Jewish story to be God's people and a Christian story, and you are part of them both. But we're not just going to tell you that story, we're going to show you that story too. And we hope that as we show and tell you a little bit of our story as God's people, eventually you will start to show and tell the story too, and it will become part of your story. Now, the story that we're showing and telling actually just started when Dahlia came in. And her parents, Rachel and Chad, told us her name, and we all gathered back there to greet her and bless her each in our own way. And one of the stories that we were starting to tell you, Dahlia, is a story about your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents who were named Sarah and Abraham. And one day at Sarah and Abraham's door, some people came that they didn't know. But Sarah and Abraham were very friendly and they welcomed them in. And they eventually had a picnic together. But what Sarah and Abraham didn't know was that those weren't just people, although they were, but they were messengers from God, and they were coming with a blessing. And the blessing was that Sarah and Abraham were going to have a baby. Now that promise sounded too good and too wonderful to be true. And so Sarah, your great-great-grandmother, actually laughed because she thought it was really funny. But it turns out it was true. And Sarah and Abraham had a baby, and through their children, the blessing of God kept just going and going and going till so many people share it. Well, when you were born, your parents also laughed for joy because they saw the blessing from God that you are. And when you arrived here just now, we also laughed for joy because we recognize the blessing that you are. You are reminding us of our story, that when strangers come to our door, it's very likely those are messengers from God, and they probably have a blessing for us. And so every time you wake up and smile, and when you get excited when your dad comes home, and when you laugh and giggle in church, you remind us of the story about how when we gather together, God's presence is with us, and there's always blessings to be had. And so as you grow, I hope you will help us remember that any stranger we meet is sent to us from God, and that we welcome them so that the blessing of Sarah and Abraham just keeps going and going and going. Well, in a few minutes, you're going to have a bath. And when we gather for that bath at that little bathtub over there, we'll start to tell you another story. It's actually our very first story in the Bible about how God made all these things at the very beginning. And at the very beginning, God's Spirit was blowing like wind over something called the deep. Maybe it was a really deep ocean or whatever it was. God reached into that deep and drew out everything that we see. The stars and the planets and the rocks and the dirt and the plants and all the animals and eventually people. And just recently, God drew you right out of that same deep. And then God bragged a little and said, that's very good. So when we set you into that little puddle over there, and don't worry, it's not that deep, we'll be showing and telling you the story about how God drew you out into the universe and made you created and very good just as you are. But there's another story too about Jesus. Jesus is who we Christians sometimes call the Son of God, and he was baptized too. And when he was baptized, he heard a voice saying, this is my Son, the Beloved. And in just a few minutes, we're going to hear that voice again. Because when we pour the water over you, we will hear God say, Dahlia, my beloved. Because that's who you are. And no one can ever take that away from you. And so we see you. We'll remember that you're God's beloved. And your parents, and your godparents, and your grandparents, and all your friends and siblings here promise to help you remember always that you're God's very good, beloved, and unique Dahlia. And as you start to grow, you might show and tell that story and remind all of us that we too are God's uniquely beloved, very good creations. And then all together we can tell that story and show it to the world so everyone knows that everyone and everything God has made is perfect and beloved just as it is. Now, Dahlia, we're getting very close to your baptism, so I'm going to give the signal to go warm up the water so it's not too cold. But after your bath, it will be time to eat. And we'll go to that table. But it's pretty much like your table, where you gather and your mom and dad bless the food and you share it together. Well, when we do it here, we'll also start to tell another story. And we know there's lots of stories about how God feeds people. One story might be the story of the Israelites when they were in the wilderness, and it didn't seem like there was going to be enough food to get them all the way to the promised land. But then lo and behold, God sent something like bread coming down from heaven. And there was enough, more than enough, to get them to the end of their journey. Or we might also remember a story about Jesus and his friends. When they went out into the wilderness and got so engrossed into what Jesus was saying, they forgot they might not have enough food to eat. And they wondered if they might go hungry. But then Jesus took what food they had and blessed it and broke it and shared it. And lo and behold, there was more than enough and some left over for everyone who had gathered. And so when we gather here to tell this story, the story that we tell is, when it seems like there's not enough, there's always more than enough. So much, in fact, that everyone on earth can have enough to eat. And that's the story that we tell when we gather at that table and when we gather at home. Now that's probably enough for this first day, Dahlia. There's so many more stories that we can tell you. And that's the promise that we are all making to you today. We are all promising to do our very best to show and tell the stories that we have inherited. Stories about welcoming any stranger to our door as God's blessing to us. Stories about how God made everything as very good and beloved, and that's true of everyone. Stories about how there's always enough, and that everyone deserves enough to eat, and in fact, there's plenty to go around. And Dahlia, the other thing we're promising you is that as you grow, we will listen as you start to tell the story, and we'll watch as you start to show us how to live it. And all together, we'll learn something new about how to show and tell our story in the world so that everyone can share the blessings of Sarah and Abraham and all of the saints that have come after. And I have a feeling that it's going to be so good and so true and so wonderful that we will laugh with joy, just like your grandmother Sarah did. And so, Dahlia, if you're ready, it's time for your bath. And so now, friends, we'll gather as they're able, as close as we can to that font, where we'll initiate Dahlia into our life as the church.